Hello, my name is Dr. Ash Catton. I have a PhD in psychology where my research focuses on disclosure of sexual victimization. What that means is that my work is all about understanding the where, why, when, and how people tell another person that they've been sexually violated. Part of that work has involved developing a survey that identifies such victims by overcoming the limitations inherent in surveys that had been developed already. In other words, I aimed to come up with a questionnaire that is more likely to accurately and correctly identify victims of sexual violations than any other questionnaire that had been published before. And recently, I was made aware of the publication of findings of an important survey of young people. The headline from RNZ proclaimed, "1 in 6 young people face sexual harm report." I found this curious for several reasons, the main reason being that the reported figure seemed unusually low. This was a survey of over 9,000 youth between the ages of 13 and 19, which is an impressive achievement to get such a large sample size of adolescents, an age group who, I imagine, would be most reluctant to bother with any sort of survey. Yet the reason for my surprise was that 1 in 6 translates roughly to 16.6%. While my own research inquires after specific acts and tactics underlying different types of sexual violations, 31% of all respondents to my survey indicated someone had touched their genitals without their consent for the very first time in their lives when they were between the ages of 14 and 17. Now, as you can see, although I surveyed for multiple types of violations, this was the one with the highest figure among an age group that's roughly similar to that in the reported survey. Guided by my curiosity, I read the article for more information. I found that it was an MSD-funded survey conducted by Ipsos with the input of several government departments and some private sector consultancy organizations. Now, I admit that I'm somewhat naive when it comes to the purpose of such publicly funded research, but I imagine it's to provide an evidence base for government policy and initiatives. If that's the case, then I also imagine it is highly desirable that such research provides as accurate a snapshot of our society as possible. We'll circle back to that at the end. I then proceeded to look over the methodology of the survey to uncover why their figure seemed lower than I would have expected. Were there any obvious concerns that meant this research, including its headline-grabbing figure, were not as accurate as it could be? Now, this is where I feel obliged, as a matter of professional courtesy, but also appreciation for anyone who ventures into this line of research, to point out what struck me as respectable and positive. Firstly, the amount of detail that is publicly provided about this work is beyond what I consider gold standard. In the present era, we expect a considerable amount of transparency with research, especially following the replication crisis through open science initiatives. The amount of information available here is impressive. So too is the consideration around informed consent, with a great deal of attention paid to navigating scenarios where participants cannot be reasonably expected to be sufficiently informed for developmental or other reasons. I was also impressed with how the survey sessions were conducted themselves, with a youth worker on hand to help deal with any distress that arises. With a survey that touches on difficult issues, it is important that someone trained and experienced in helping young people manage distress, anxiety, fear, and anything else that may come up is a sign that humane considerations were reflected upon and planned for in advance. As someone who has conducted research that has provoked distress among participants, I cannot state how relieved I was that this was considered. Now, there are pros and cons to conducting this kind of research in a school setting, as far as my own work around disclosure is concerned. The pro is that young respondents aren't likely to have their answers censored by parents or guardians who may be weary that a truthful response reflects badly upon them. Although I have no doubt that such a fear may have influenced their responses, the physical absence of a parent or guardian provides a certain sense of liberation when it comes to answering sensitive questions. That said, the physical proximity of peers can also result in a type of self-censorship, particularly if the survey is conducted within the eye line of a friend or peer. Despite that, I would still give this work a thumbs up, as a school setting is probably the best practical location in ensuring that an honest answer for a survey is provided among large gatherings at one time. Well, why then would their figure be so low, given what sounds like an optimal setting? I looked over the wording of the questions themselves and sighed. There are 3 questions pertaining to sexual harm. However, before I proceed to dissect the questions themselves, I wish firstly to present my own understanding of the term sexual harm. It's not a term I use often, although I have used it in the past to soften the terminology around sensitive topics. I find that pearls are more likely to be left unclenched if one refers to sexual harm rather than rape or sexual assault. It's a subjective term, an outcome, referring to distress and potential trauma after being sexually violated. For that reason, I don't use this term often, as I try to be objective in my work, focusing on all people who have been sexually violated, whether they found it harmful or not. Looking at the first question in the series, have you ever had a harmful experience of sexting? Now, this is one I had to reflect on for several reasons after reading it. Sexting isn't something I've covered in my research, at least not what I understood the term to refer to. I understood it to describe intimate discussions by some electronic means, such as text messaging or messaging on some online application. However, the survey provides a definition of what they mean. They say sending nudes or sexual pictures, or someone sending nudes and sexual pictures to you on a smartphone or online. Well, this is at odds with what I thought it was, as they clearly mean receiving unsolicited nudes or the forced sending of nudes. I find it unusual that both the sending and receiving are lumped together. When I was designing my survey in 2022, I followed the work of other researchers whose work is considered gold standard. Those researchers conceptualize sexual violation as something that occurs on a continuum or a spectrum, where it has matter of degrees rather than a dichotomous it is or it isn't concept. Now, in this case, I had being a victim of voyeurism and non-consensual intimate recordings at the lower end of the violation spectrum, given the lack of physical contact involved in the violation itself, and what some people may consider gang rape at the far extreme end of the spectrum. I reflected briefly on whether I should consider receiving nude images, unprompted and unwanted, as a violation worth including at the lower end. But given that my work focuses on disclosure of sexual violations, I considered that receiving a nude wasn't likely to cause the kind of distress or potential trauma that motivates disclosures. Being recorded in an intimate setting without one's consent, however, definitely was, and was a topical issue at the time I was compiling the survey, so that acted as my starting point for the lower end of the spectrum. I guess my point here is that I find it unusual that this question would be asked, given that one scenario is likely to be much more distressing than the other. I'm also unsure why this question was asked at all. It is the only question that asks about specific activities, so it may be that they are looking to see how common this new means of sexual violation is. But the question itself could be more precise. When I was constructing my survey, I always came back to the questions, What exactly is it that I want to know? And does this question tell me what I want to know? I'm not sure that this question provides a specific answer to anything. Continuing with this question, I note they also provided a definition of what they mean by harmful. Sexting is considered harmful when you didn't consent to participating in it, so you are sending or receiving nudes or other sexual content against your wishes, or your own sex to have been shared without your permission. Note that I earlier stated I considered harmful to be subjective, an outcome term describing distress. This definition provides an objective account of what they consider the word harmful to denote. A definition, I must emphasize, that is at odds with the use of the term itself. For instance, if we consult the Oxford Dictionary, they state harmful means causing or likely to cause harm. Their definition of harm, then, contains several entries that I shan't bore you with here, but they refer to ill effects, material damage, physical injury, etc. Now, I don't wish to enter into any sort of debate about whether a lack of consent in sending or receiving nudes constitutes harm. No doubt there are people who argue that it is harmful, even in the absence of any distress. My concern, rather, is about the tension between the typical understanding of the term harmful and the definition they provide. The fact that there is such a mismatch introduces ambiguity, something that must be avoided or reduced to a bare minimum at all costs, especially when surveying young people. Why? Because victims of sexual violations, and especially young people, are extremely risk averse. If they are uncertain whether their situation can appropriately fall under the label you have provided, most will conclude that it does not match this label and conceal their experience by answering in the negative. You need to spell out exactly what you mean. If a young person had nude photographs of them sent to other people, but they weren't sure if it was strictly consensual or they weren't sure if others would call it harmful, then they aren't going to tell you about it. They'll clam up, and you've confounded your results before you've even deployed your survey. This kind of research requires you to be as specific as possible to reduce ambiguity as much as possible, so your respondents aren't left trying to figure out if their experience qualifies as the thing you're asking about. While the next question was about porn consumption and isn't strictly about victimization, the next two questions were: have you ever felt pressured to do things that you or someone else saw in porn? And have you ever been touched in a sexual way or made to do sexual things that you didn't want to, include sexual abuse or rape? I'm not sure why the question about porn was included, but I suspect it was to specifically look at potentially harmful effects of porn exposure among young people. And if so, then it's a worthy item to include. The wording, however, is still quite vague. I specifically take issue with the word pressure, as that does not come with an accompanying definition. Even with adults, such a word needs to be elaborated upon. For example, in my own survey, where I have an item that asks about verbal coercion, and the wording itself refers to verbal pressure, there is an accompanying list of examples that includes lies, threats, and nagging. So again, with young people, such an inclusion would be even more important here. My critique of the final question is probably obvious by now. Now, firstly, it's a double-barreled question. These are fine for screening questions, but if there are no follow-up questions, these should ideally be separated. However, one thing I can appreciate is that over 100 questions have been asked by this stage, and fatigue and indifference might be setting in among a young person who just wants to get through the survey. Now, in that light, lumping things into a single question for the sake of parsimony may be considered a virtue, and I wouldn't disagree with that kind of argument. So secondly, we go back to our question: what is it we want to know? Well, I suspect we want to know if the young person has been sexually violated. Does this question tell us this? Yes, but it could be significantly refined to increase the likelihood of getting an accurate response. Well, what could be done to reduce ambiguity in that question? Getting rid of vague terms like sexual way and sexual things, and spell out exactly what you mean. Now, admittedly, my own survey question that pertains to non consensual touching is quite lengthy, and I wouldn't recommend it worded in this way for a young person. But as an example of how you can increase the likelihood that someone who's actually been touched responds in the affirmative, my question asks, how many times in your lifetime has any person without your consent or permission ever touched or kissed your genitals, breasts, chest, or bottom, kissed you on the lips, or removed any of your clothes, or made you do any of these to another person but did not attempt to have sex? By explicitly stating the scenarios you are referring to, you reduce ambiguity. I'm not sure if the sentence referring to sexual abuse or rape was included in the question itself or as some sort of administrative note, but if it was added, that too would foster concealment of an accurate answer. By including loaded terms where the definitions themselves vary so much over time, by country, or even between conversations as to render them nebulous, you introduce a great deal of ambiguity, which, as I keep highlighting, confounds your findings. So to bring this full circle, to answer my question about whether this research provides an accurate snapshot of society as possible, after an admittedly lengthy reflection, I cannot say that it does. There is much to admire and respect about this endeavour, but when it comes to interpreting the sexual harm aspect of this work, I find myself unable to articulate what the reported figures are actually reporting.